Okay, imagine this for a second. You've just sold your service business. You've poured years of your life into this thing, you build it from scratch, and you finally close the deal. The handshakes, the signatures, it's all done. But then you check your bank account and your heart just sinks. Something is very, very wrong.
You agreed on a fantastic price. The letter of intent, the purchase agreement, everything said $5 million. That's the number that's been in your head for months, right? That's the number you've been planning your future around.
But this is what actually hits your account. $4.7 million. A full $300,000 has just vanished. And look, that's not a rounding error. That is a significant, painful chunk of your payout.
So the immediate and, let's be honest, pretty gut-wrenching question is, where did that money go? It wasn't some last-minute price negotiation or a hidden fee you missed. Nope. It was something way more subtle, and it's something that catches even savvy business owners completely off guard, all the time. Well, what you've just experienced is something we call the working capital trap. That is the name for that $300,000 surprise, and trust me, it's a concept you absolutely have to understand if you ever plan on selling your business.
And you got to understand, this isn't some rare, unlucky thing that just happens. It is a common, calculated pitfall. Smart buyers and their lenders are laser-focused on working capital because they know how to structure the deal in their favor. And that money, it often comes directly out of your pocket.
Okay, so if we're going to avoid this trap, we have to understand how it works. We need to get under the hood. So what exactly is this working capital that can have such a huge impact on your final payday?
And it's actually pretty simple. Net working capital, or NWC for short, is basically the lifeblood of a business. It's the operational cash you need to run the company day to day, to bridge that gap between when you have to pay your bills and when your customers actually pay you.
And the math behind it couldn't be more straightforward. You just take your current assets, stuff like cash in the bank and money that clients owe you, and you subtract your current liabilities, which is just the money you owe in the near future. What's left over is your net working capital. Simple.
Now, here's why this concept is so incredibly important for service businesses. Unlike, say, a manufacturer or a retail store, a service business doesn't have a giant warehouse full of physical stuff, right? There's no inventory. Your main assets are often things you can't even see, which makes this whole calculation really unique. So, for a service business, it all boils down to these 4 accounts. You've got your accounts receivable, that's money your clients owe you. Accounts payable, that's what you owe your vendors. Prepaid expenses, think of your annual insurance policy. And accrued liabilities, costs you've racked up but haven't paid yet, like payroll. These 4 things, this is the battleground where hundreds of thousands of dollars can be won or lost in a deal.
And speaking of the battleground, let's talk about the other side of the table. Because buyers, they have a well-rehearsed playbook for using working capital to their advantage. Let's pull back the curtain on how they do it.
A buyer isn't just going to guess. Oh no. They're going to meticulously comb through your financials for the last 6, maybe 12 months, and they're going to establish what's called a PEG. It's basically a target amount of working capital they claim the business needs to run smoothly. And their goal, obviously, is to set that PEG as high as humanly possible. Let's look at a real-world example from an M&A advisor named Vinod Ramchandran. He was in the middle of selling a company. A deal was practically done. Then, right at the 11th hour, the buyer dropped a bomb. They demanded an extra $100,000 in cash had to be left in the business at closing. Now, their justification? It sounded pretty reasonable on the surface. They basically argued that on that specific closing date, the business's working capital was $100,000 short of the target they'd agreed on. But the seller's advisor knew something was fishy.
So here's what was really going on. The advisor pointed out that the business had a very predictable seasonal billing cycle. And where were they in that cycle? They were right in a low point, just before a massive quarterly billing spike was about to happen. The buyer had strategically picked the closing date to be at the absolute lowest point for working capital. If they had just waited a couple of weeks, it would have been way over the target.
The conclusion was crystal clear. The buyer knew all about the billing cycle. They'd seen it in due diligence. They were just taking a shot. They were hoping the seller would be so tired, so ready to be done with the whole process, that they'd just give up the extra $100,000 without a fight. That story just really drives home how high the stakes are. So how do you build a defense? How do you make sure this doesn't happen to you? Let's talk strategy. All right, let's start with what not to do. Here are some of the classic mistakes sellers make. A huge one is agreeing on that working capital target way too early, like in the initial letter of intent, before you've even done a deep dive. Another one is completely forgetting about off-balance sheet items, which can really come back to bite you later.
So, the proactive approach looks a lot more like this. Months, maybe even a year before you even think about selling, you start actively managing your working capital. That means speeding up your collections, being strategic about when you pay your bills, getting all your documents in perfect order, and, this is the big one, working with expert advisors who have seen these buyer games 100 times before.
You know, it all comes down to this one simple idea: protecting the number you agreed on. Every single dollar that goes into a working capital adjustment is one less dollar that ends up in your bank account.
So let's just recap the absolute must-knows here. First, you have to understand the working capital peg and exactly how it's calculated. Second, watch your cash flow like a hawk, especially in the months leading up to a sale. Third, define every single term in writing in that purchase agreement. Fourth, know your business's seasonal ups and downs inside and out. And of course, get professional help. Don't go it alone.
And that really leaves us with one final, and maybe the most critical question to think about. Because when you finally decide to sell, a buyer is going to put every single part of your business under a microscope. The working capital trap is just one area they're going to probe. The real question you have to ask yourself is, are you ready for that level of scrutiny?